Hi, I'm C.S. Lakin, and thanks for joining me today on this session about scene structure. I work with a lot of writers all over the world. I've been copy editing and critiquing manuscripts for about 15 years. I do about 200 manuscript critiques a year. So I read a lot of scenes, and I see a lot of the same problems in the scenes that I deal with and that I work on. And I want to talk to you today about some tips on how to write great scenes and how to determine what type of scene that you're going to need. And I hope this information is going to be really new, unique, and helpful to you, because I think scene structure is one of the most important elements of writing a novel, but it's also one of the hardest things to do well. So we're going to cover a few different topics today. I want to get into some basics, and I'm going to give you some ideas that I use for writing my scenes and see if they're helpful to you. The first thing I want to talk about is basic scene structure and today's reader. Back in the day, when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, back when I was first writing many years ago, novels were mostly narrative. They were long exposés of information dumps and backstory. All you have to do is pick up a James Michener novel, for example, like Alaska, and you'll see the first 100 pages or so are about the geology and the formation of the earth way back in the beginning of time. I mean, none of this is how we write novels today, because today's readers have been influenced so greatly by television, movies, even video games. What we're seeing is a real propensity and interest in cinematic technique, basically. Novels today have to be like movies. They need to be cinematic in the sense that the scenes have to feel as if we are watching them on the movie screen. And so when I sit down to write a scene, that's exactly what I think about. I think about, how is this going to open? How does the scene open? And what am I going to see? What's the first thing I'm going to see? I'm going to see maybe a setting, maybe a character in a setting, but definitely a setting, right? So if we translate that into writing a scene, we need to establish that setting pretty close to the beginning. Sure, you might have a few lines of dialogue that open your scene, but you need to really establish where that place is, where that character is grounded in that setting. And you need to do that quickly, and you need to do it with some sensory detail. I always aim for about maybe 3 different senses to throw in. And also the sensory detail that you share, of course, needs to be in point of view. What do I mean? Well, you're in your point of view character's head for the entire scene. And this is something I really want to drill into your brain through this little session that we're having here. And that's that scenes are in deep point of view. It's really rare today to see omniscient writing or distant point of view. And again, this is because readers want to go deep cinematically into the characters. When we watch movies or TV shows or watch plays these days, contemporary pieces, we see how they're really deep into character. You don't have a narrator that's sort of sitting back in the wings kind of telling you about everything. You're actually in the character's senses. You're seeing through her eyes. You're feeling through her gut. And all the things that are being experienced in the scene are coming through that character. So when you're in deep point of view in a scene and you're starting that scene, you're immediately going to show the setting by or through the character, but not just through that character's eyes. You need to make sure the setting is conveyed through that character's voice, how she talks and thinks, and also through her mood. And this is really important because we're going to get into those 3 M's of character setup, which is mindset, mood, and motivation. But for now, I just want to touch on this bigger picture. And this bigger picture is all about setting the stage for your scene so that you immediately establish your character, whoever the point of view character is for that scene. And the rule is you can only have 1 character per point of view per scene, meaning that you can't go head hopping within a scene. And you can certainly do a scene break and switch to another point of view character, that's fine. But within 1 scene, you need to stay in that 1 character's point of view. So if you didn't know that, I hope you understand that. That's really important. And what does that mean? When you're in a character's point of view, one way to picture it is grab a toilet paper roll and look through that hole, right? So anything that the character can see through that toilet paper roll can be included in your scene. You can't say, George was sitting thinking about his best friend Amanda, and Amanda looked over at him and was thinking, oh, I hope George isn't thinking about me. That's kind of a lame example, but the whole point being that when you're in George's point of view, you can only show what George is thinking. He can guess what Amanda is thinking. He can observe Amanda and see her expressions, see her gestures, make up or imagine what she might be feeling in that moment, based on how well he knows her or fantasies about her or whatever, but he can't know for sure. He can only guess. So when you're in point of view and you're dealing with your character and you're setting up the setting, you need to first think about, what is my character's frame of mind? This is one of the 3 M's, the mindset. What's the character's mood? And the reason this is important is it affects your word choice. It affects the way you write sentences and the way you set up the scene, the feeling and the mood of the scene. It really should reflect what the character is feeling. It shouldn't sound like Joe, author, is telling you about this character and telling you about the setting, right? So everything in a scene needs to be coming through your character's senses. So as I mentioned, I might use like 3 different types of sensory details. I might show, of course, something visual, unless my character is waking up somewhere in the dark or she's blindfolded in the trunk of a car. Maybe she can't see anything, right? So you want to decide which senses you want to use. And one thing that I found super helpful is to understand that there aren't just 5 senses. There are actually more than 20. And I do have a handout on the 21 senses that's drawn from the research and work that Beth Barani has done. If you're familiar with Beth Barani, she's a writing coach. And it's really super helpful to understand that we have way, way more senses than we normally think. And it's really helpful if you as a writer dip into those different senses and utilize them so that you don't always just describe a person or describe setting with visual details. Like George walked outside and he saw a tree and some birds and a garden. That's just so boring, right? But if George walks outside and he immediately senses the feel of the air, the weather, it's sticky because it's humid and hot and he's in the South, that's a sensory element, how your body feels in relation to what happens to your skin, pressure on your skin, sensation on your skin. That's one sensory detail, right? Another one that I like to use a lot is lighting. What's the lighting like? It may be a bright sunny day, but how could you describe the lighting so that it has more of a sensory detail? Is it filtering through the leaves and the trees and dripping like yellow paint all over the sidewalk? Is the lighting in a house, for instance, in the evening? Maybe there's just a little lamp lit in the corner and the person that walks into the room can't see that much. Lighting is a sensory detail. I mean, obviously that's sight, but you can play with that on a much more diverse palette in terms of how to present that light. Also, light can also affect brightness, can affect your eyes. There's a pain receptor in your eyes for light. So think about that. So while I'm not going to get into a lot of the detail about sensory input and those 21 senses that we have, take a look at the handout. If that's available to you, you might be able to get that through my website, or you can email me for that. So what I'd like to focus on here, as I mentioned, is some basics of scene structure. So we're going to look over a couple different documents that I've created that I use very often and I give out to a lot of my clients. And you can also access these through my website, Live, Write, Thrive, on my resource page. So feel free to go over there and download them. But we're going to take a look at them today because I feel it's so important to understand this cinematic approach to making scenes and to understand that scene structure is all about a capsule of time. It's all about putting your character in a brief situation for a brief moment. And as you move through the story, you just start putting these little capsules of time together. I picture them as like stringing pearls on a necklace. Instead of having these long, drawn out type scenes that go on and then jump ahead 3 days and then move on 3 hours. And they just seem to kind of go endlessly without having a purpose or building to a specific high moment. We want to think about scenes as these small capsules of time. And what I do, which I've never heard anybody talk about, but this is my method or my approach to scene structure, is I try to limit my scenes on average to 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes at most for my point of view character. What do I mean? I mean that from the first line of the scene, if you see where the character is, if they looked at their watch and then run the whole scene through and you get to the last line of the scene and they look at their watch again, that would be only 15 minutes. That might sound kind of weird to you, but that's exactly what makes a great scene, regardless of genre. If you're reading a bestseller that you love and you pay attention to that amount of time that passes, I bet you'll find that on average, most of the scenes in that book will be 15 or 20 minutes. Now, of course, there's going to be exceptions to that because there's times when you're maybe cutting to other characters, other point of view characters during a chapter, and that one scene, for instance, might be just a little clip of overhearing what somebody's talking about. It might only be 30 seconds long. And you'll also see this when you get to faster action scenes and moments, especially if you're writing thrillers and you're getting to the climax. You might find lots of small scenes that are just even 20 seconds, where a character is running across the street and chasing a bad guy, and all of a sudden you cut to the killer and he's hiding, under a barrel or something like that, right? So again, we're talking cinematically, and this is one thing that you can just train your brain to do, is to approach your scenes, whether you're revising a scene or whether you're planning out a scene, to aim for that 15 or 20 minutes. And I will venture to say that if you're having trouble with a scene and it's dragging on and on and on, it's because you're going on too long. And that's only one of the reasons. I mean, there certainly can be more. And I would say that's probably has a lot to do with the build and the high moment at the end that you're not getting to. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. So again, when we're talking about cinematic structure, you could take a look at my book, Shoot Your Novel, which is all about using cinematic technique, filmmaking technique to do your scenes. And I use a lot of examples of screenplays and novels to show how authors can take the same kind of effect or technique that screenwriters use to create really dynamic scenes. What do I mean? Well, think about these different camera angles. Back in the day, when movies were made, I think of like Fred Astaire movies, they would do the entire dance number with one camera in the back of the restaurant room or wherever they're on stage doing their dance, and it would be one take, the whole entire dance. They didn't really do a lot of film editing way back in the day. So now when we see movies and TV shows and films, there's a lot of editing involved. So there's lots of different camera angles. I grew up in the TV industry. My mother was a TV screenwriter and story editor. She was a producer of a lot of shows. She created a lot of shows for television. My brother also was a TV producer and screenwriter. So I grew up on sets and I read a lot of scripts growing up. And one thing that really got ingrained into my brain as I read and also started writing at a young age was to think in terms of camera shots and piecing together those different angles. Whenever a scene is filmed, for instance, on a set, they'll always do it, like say there's a two shot with two people. And if they show part of the scene facing one actor from one angle, they take the opposite angle and then they do the whole scene again and they shoot the other person. They might piece it together. You'll notice how they'll flip back and forth oftentimes from one character to another. But again, this is all about piecing together these camera shots. And so if you can start thinking cinematically about your scenes and plotting them out in terms of where is the camera? Are you zooming in to see something important? Are you pulling back to reveal more of the setting? Those are elements that are going to really serve you well to write great dynamic scenes. So I've talked a little bit about point of view, about grounding your setting and your scene in your character's point of view. I also want to talk a little bit about point of view, character voice, because one thing that I think most writers don't really understand about writing in deep point of view is that every single word of every scene is your character's voice. That means every line, even when you're describing setting, even when you're just giving a bit of backstory, it has to sound like it's the character thinking. Okay, so when you're developing your characters, you need to really work on their voice. Each of them should sound unique, have their own voice based on their upbringing, their education, their ethnicity, where they grew up, who they hung out with, what their age is. There's so many factors that go into how a person talks. All you have to do is just listen to your friends and listen to people on TV, news people, whatever. And you can hear how each person really does have their own style of speaking and voice. And so you want to bring that into your story. The more you can develop a strong point of view character voice and bring it into the narrative in the scenes, the more powerful and more cinematic. She writes these murder mysteries, the Inspector Lindley series that was also adapted into PBS series. And she goes very deep into her characters, even her minor and incidental characters. She'll do point of view scenes with them and go really deep into their voice. I think she might have had a desire subconsciously to be an actress, because she actually just sort of becomes these characters and they just come to life. And they're so fascinating because of their voice. So scenes are really all about character voice. So keep that in mind, that everything that you're going to tell in that scene has got to sound like your character, feel like your character, express your character's mood or mindset. And the third M is also the motivation. You want to always hint as soon as possible in your scene what your character's motivation is for that scene. Why are they doing what they're doing right in this moment where you start? Okay. So keep that in mind. The third M I touched on, mood, isn't so much the mood of your character as it is the mood or tone that you want to set for the scene. If your character is in a funk and is feeling depressed, you're not going to use bright, happy language, and you're not going to show bright, happy things unless you're going to show them to be contrast with your character's mood. You know, a person that's in anguish might go outside on a beautiful, gorgeous, sunny day where the birds are singing and the creek is bubbling and feel utterly broken because the pain that they're suffering feels so incongruous to the setting that they're in. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to start by taking a look at one of my worksheets. And I'm going to pull it up on the camera for you so that you can take a look at it as I talk about it. But let's go through some of this. It's called 8-Step Process for a Solid Scene, or 8 Steps to a Perfect Scene. So the first item, when you're dealing with a scene, you're trying to come up with a scene, of course you can use this also when you're checking your scenes that you've already written, is to identify the purpose of your scene. And I know that sounds really simple, but it's really important. And I think a lot of times writers are missing this. They'll write an entire scene and I'll read it and go, what was the point of that scene? I actually did that today working on a critique. I just could not make any sense of this scene. Like, what was the point of it? It was a couple people doing some crazy stuff and talking and, you know, going to a bar and getting in trouble and all this stuff. It had nothing to do with the plot, nothing to do with the premise. It had no purpose, really. And so every scene that you have in your novel really needs to serve a purpose. What purpose? To help advance the plot that's based on your premise. If your story is about a bunch of people that go rob a bank and then take that money and hide it somewhere, and then, you know, then they have to try to find a way to get back to dig it up, you know, you're not going to show scenes with these characters off, like, you know, at a dance party if nothing happens at the dance party. Everything that happens should be significant to move your plot forward. Okay. So number 1, identify the purpose of the scene. In one sentence, explain what you intend to accomplish with the scene. It should be simple. If you can't figure out what your purpose of your scene is, it sounds like you need to throw the scene out, or maybe revisit it later or come up with some other details to the scene to make it work. So be sure that you know what purpose every scene is serving, and that speaks to the bigger picture, which is really being able to understand what scenes go where and what scenes you need. If you really are not familiar at all with novel structure, that's where you need to start. I would suggest that you get my book, Layer Your Novel, study it very carefully, and learn first of all what your 10 key scenes are. Each specific foundational scene needs to go in a specific place, and it serves a very particular purpose. Okay? So identify the purpose of your scene. So let's say the purpose of your scene is to show that your character discovers a baby in a trunk that's floating in the bay where his fishing nets are tangled up after a storm. Okay, this is a scene from my novel, which one? Crystal Scepter, the 5th book in my fantasy series. So let's say I sit down and I think, okay, what do I need to have happen in this scene? I need to have him find this box and discover this baby. It's a really, really important moment. It's a high moment. for my book, but it's also the key or high moment for my scene, which brings me to step number 2. Identify the high moment. What is the key moment your scene is going to build toward? Describe in one sentence what will happen and why it's important to your story. Okay, so I've got this scene. My old fisherman needs to find this baby in the trunk that's floating in his fishing nets in the bay after a storm. That's my high moment. The high moment is going to come at the end. At the end of my scene, he is going to find that box, open it up. He's going to discover this baby. He's going to find the gems, the little bag of gems, and the note from the queen saying, who this baby is, that he's royalty. Please keep his identity secret because his father is trying to kill him. Please raise him as your own child. And, that's a huge shocker for this man. And I've already set up that this fisherman had already lost his son in a fishing accident. His fault for being drunk caused his son to fall overboard and drown. So he's dealing with a lot of grief. This is a huge moment for him to have to decide whether he is going to raise this baby. And he's been given this another chance, he feels. So he needs to do it right. So I know what my high moment is. So then what do? I need to think about that 20 minutes, right? So I could have started the scene with Arnold, my fisherman, waking up in the morning and brushing his teeth and taking a walk along the bay and maybe eating breakfast and then maybe having a conversation with his neighbor and on and boring, right? Because first of all, readers don't want to hear about ordinary life. They don't want to read about boring, ordinary, on-the-nose stuff. So leave it out, right? I think it was Elmore Leonard that said, or maybe it was Huck Twain, you'll have to check me on that, said, leave out the boring parts and just leave the interesting parts in. That's great advice, right? For all of us. So on identifying my high moment, I know where my character needs to be at the end of the scene. Your high moment is usually the last line of a scene or it's the last paragraph, okay? So when you read great novels, you'll see that each scene ends with a great high moment. If it doesn't, then it's not as good as it could be, okay? So you want to aim for an opening hook for every scene, which is basically your promise to your reader, and you want to end with some great hook, right? Okay, so now we're going to work backwards. Where would I start my character 15, 20 minutes before that moment? Okay, so I decide to have Arnold walking out of his door, immediately seeing all the debris and mess from the beach that the storm has caused. He has a little shack right on the coast, on the shivery coast in my town of Tolpuddle. And he goes outside, and I decided to make it the anniversary of his son's death. And so he's already very depressed. It's morning. He knows his nets are going to be a mess, his fishing nets, because he catches fish in the bay by putting nets out. And so I have him start heading over right away toward the bay. I'm not going to have him dawdle for an hour or two, right? So he heads over toward the bay, and on the way he stops at the memorial, which is a little stone or whatever. I'm not sure what I wrote in the book, which I wrote quite a few years ago. But he heads over to the stone, and he's very depressed and emotional about having lost his son, and he's thinking about how guilty he feels and how his wife left him and all that stuff. Why do I do that? Because I need to punch home the high moment. What's the high moment? He's going to find a baby, and he's going to realize that he's been given a second chance to raise another son. And he feels that this is a gift, maybe even a test from God, that he has to do this. So, of course, it works really well for me to have him thinking about his son that he lost and feeling so guilty and feeling like he should end his life even. And so then he heads over and sees the nets, starts to untangle them, notices something bobbing in the nets, realizes it's a trunk, pulls the trunk up onto the dock, opens the trunk, finds the baby, horror, shock, the baby is alive. And, as I mentioned, he finds this bag of gems, he sees a note, and then his moment is that he has to process this, right? So keep in mind, you want to always have natural action, reaction, processing sequence. And if you aren't familiar with that, you can take a free module on action, reaction at my online course at cslaken.teachable.com. Go click on Emotional Mastery for Fiction Writers, and when you get on that page, scroll down to where it says Action Reaction Preview in the curriculum, and you can watch this 38-minute module, and it's going to talk about how your characters need to act, then react. So what happens when you work on a scene is you have to decide what your character is going to go through in that 15 or 20 minutes, and then whether you're going to end on a note of action, reaction, or processing, because the cycle is action, reaction, processing, new decision, then a new action. And that's a cycle that can go many, many times over in one scene, or it might only be one of those in an entire scene. In a detective story, for instance, you could have characters processing for an entire scene. They just found a clue for a murder mystery, and they're talking about what that clue means, so they're processing. Okay, so it really just depends on your story and your plot and your genre, what type of cycle you're going to have, how quickly those cycles are going to move, and what is happening in your story. So here's the character at the end of the scene. He's reacting to this trunk he found, this baby, and then he starts to process, and he decides that he's going to head to town and go to his neighbor's house that just had a new baby, and get some milk, get some clothes. He's made a decision that he's going to raise this child. Okay, our third step rather in this 8-step process for a perfect scene, after you've identified the purpose and you've identified the high moment, and you've worked your way back 20 minutes or so you know where to start your story, is conflict, inner and outer. Describe the inner and outer conflict that will permeate this scene and what this conflict will accomplish. This is really, really important. If you have no conflict in your scene, it is useless. It's horrible. I will venture to say, as I always do, conflict is story. And you need to have conflict on every single page. It can be external conflict. It could be internal conflict. Conflict is tension. So what do I mean by conflict? It doesn't mean that you have to have people fighting on every page, but conflict is when anything just is rubbing against something else, right? So if you've got this character, for instance, my character Arnold, this fisherman, he's got a lot of inner conflict. There's no outer conflict happening in that scene, right? But the inner conflict is really high, and it's always the best, I think. It's better to have inner conflict than outer conflict to me. Again, if you're doing a thriller, a big suspense thriller, and there's a lot of chase scenes and stuff like that, the outer conflict is probably going to be forefront. But when you can bring in inner conflict, a character that's conflicted about things, that's facing a dilemma, a moral dilemma, or just having a hard time making a choice, even if it's a small choice, it can add tension and conflict. Of course, interpersonal conflict is great. But in my scene with Arnold, for instance, there's nobody else there in the scene but him. So for me to have conflict, he can either fight with some seagulls over the fish, or he can fight with himself. And of course, I created a lot of inner conflict for him in that scene because he's struggling with his guilt and his horrible feelings of loss that he's dealing with. So his inner conflict, of course, comes really into play when he finds this baby and he realizes somebody needs to raise it and he could just give it away. But he feels this sense of responsibility and also of fate and destiny, so that here's this inner conflict. He doesn't want to raise another child. It's not because he doesn't want the responsibility, it's he's terrified that he will make the same mistakes. He hasn't had a drink of alcohol in a year, but he's terrified that he's a weak man and that he will fail, and that somehow this boy, when he grows up or as he's growing up, might be endangered by him. So lots of inner conflict here. And if you want to know what happens in the story, you can read The Crystal Scepter. Okay, so step number 4. How does your character change by the end of the scene? Okay, this is important. I feel that characters need to change in some way in every single scene. And I even wrote a blog post last year called Every Scene Should Contain a Death. This was based on my friend James Scott Bell's belief or teaching that every novel should have a death in it. I take that one step further and say every scene should have a death in it. Of course, if you're writing a murder mystery, you might actually have a literal death in 1 or 2 of your scenes. But that's obviously not what we're talking about for most novels and most scenes. So what do I mean? A death could be applied to anything, okay? A death of a dream, an idea, a concept, an opinion, an understanding, a friendship, a job, a relationship of some sort. So let's take my example with Arnold the fisherman. What happens? How does he change by the end of the scene? Well, he starts off very depressed and even suicidal, right? He's very depressed. It's the anniversary of his son's death. he gets to the bay and gets this baby out of the trunk. Now, how has he changed? All of a sudden, his demeanor has changed. His outlook has changed. What has died? His hopelessness has died. His feeling of that God has completely abandoned him has died. All of a sudden, he feels a shift in his destiny. He might even feel a little twinge of hope, maybe some trepidation. But you can see how the character has changed by the end of the scene. He's not the same as he was 20 minutes earlier when he stepped out of his little cottage, his shack on the beach, feeling very depressed because of what he had done, right? So think about how your character might change by the end. And again, it can be really subtle. Oftentimes it's just a change in perspective. Because when the plot is advanced and the character learns something new, that should change him, change his approach, change the way he views something. If you have a detective story and he thought somebody was guilty and then he finds a new clue and realizes that this person isn't guilty, what's changed is his view of that person. All of a sudden he realizes that someone else is out there that's guilty of this crime, right? If you're doing a love story, a romantic story, maybe the character has this idealized view of this man that she is hoping to marry, and then she sees him behave in a certain way, and all of a sudden her attitude toward him changes. He does something that is something that she didn't expect, that really shines a bad light on him. Conversely, it could be something different. It could be a guy that she really didn't like very much, but then she sees him do something really wonderful for somebody, and all of a sudden her perspective of that man changes. So I hope you'll keep that in mind too. So those are the 4 key elements to working on a scene. And the other 4 are a little more specific and smaller. For instance, number 5 is determine the point of view. Now, that's pretty easy if you're writing a first-person novel. You already know what point of view you're in. But if you're doing shifting third-person point of view, or maybe a combination of first and third, oftentimes I read novels where the protagonist is in first person and all the other characters are in third person. I see this in James Lee Burke's novels, for example. So you might have a choice between a number of characters of whose point of view it should be. So how do you determine whose point of view it is? Well, you want to figure out who is the best person to show what's happening, whose insight is most important. You might have a scene with your protagonist and his sidekick, and maybe his sidekick is a point of view character as well in some of the scenes. But maybe you want the sidekick to see something or notice something or process something that happens in a way that only he can, that's important to the story. It's important to reveal to your reader. So you'll choose to put that scene in the sidekick's point of view, okay? So there's a lot more to determining point of view, but that's the basic sum of it. Number 6, I think I mentioned this. Leave the boring stuff out. Keep what's interesting, take out what's boring. So now as you're writing your scene, or maybe you've already written a rough draft, let it gush, write it as wordy as you want, come back in and take out the boring stuff. Again, if you start a scene knowing where your high moment is, what's important, what the purpose of your scene is, that this is going to be an important scene, serves a purpose, you know your high moment, you go back 20 minutes, start the scene in the middle of action, you build and build and build with obstacles or twists or complications or inner and outer conflict. You're not going to have too much boring stuff, right? First of all, you don't have time to put in too much boring stuff. If you have your character spend 15 minutes looking at the flowers, that's boring and you haven't built to this high moment, right? So I hope that this helps you understand that this is a great way to write dynamic scenes. This is also going to keep you from putting in too much backstory, because if you dump a lot of backstory in, you're just stopping the action that's happening in the present and you're putting in a lot of extra information. So if you have to put in some backstory, keep it to 2 or 3 lines at most. Make it pertinent. Don't just put backstory in to explain something. You're in your character's point of view. It needs to be through her eyes. She's the one that's going to be thinking of that backstory. So what's going to trigger it? If my character Arnold walks over to that memorial that he made for his son, obviously he's going to think about his son. He's going to think about that terrible day where he went out to sea drunk with his son and his son fell overboard and he was too drunk to save him. He's going to think about how his wife left and how his whole life fell apart because of what he did that day. And he's going to think of all those things because it's the anniversary of his son's death, and going to that memorial stone triggers those thoughts, those bits of backstory. So always have a trigger for the backstory. Don't ever just start explaining something about how your character went to high school in, Indiana, and he was top of his class, and then he went on to college and decided to become, a quarterback. If that has nothing to do with the moment, if the character is not like suddenly coming across his award from when he was in college, or what his valedictorian speech notes from when he was in high school, what's the point of bringing that out? And it doesn't fit the moment. It doesn't feel organic. And if any of that is not important to the story, don't have any of it in there. Okay. Leave the boring stuff out. Leave the unimportant stuff out. Okay. Step 7, work on your beginning and ending hooks. Spend some time making the opening of your scene engaging. Yes, we know our novel has to have a hook at the very opening. The very first line of our novel has to have a hook. But every scene, I feel, should have some sort of a hook. It may not be dramatic. It might just be just an opening line that helps you get right into the next scene. But I feel that the more you spend on making a really interesting opening to every scene, the better. And also, of course, you want to have that ending hook to be killer. It should be great. I don't care what genre you're writing in. You want to really make those last lines of the scene just punch home your character's feeling, your character's mood, how your character has changed, what new revelation they've come to, what new twist has happened. It may be that your scene is going to end with action. That's fine. Your character could be walking down a street and there's a big explosion, and all of a sudden your character's thrown against a building and knocked out. End of scene. That's fine too. That's a cliffhanger. That's dynamic. And your purpose or your high moment of the scene is to show the explosion. That's good. Okay. Number 8. This is where you add in texture and sensory details. I mentioned the sensory details earlier, but you might need to go back through and put those in. Try to find spots on every single page where you add in some sensory detail. And again, it doesn't have to just be sight. It could be smell, hearing. It could be physical sensations. It could be the way that they feel inside. Maybe their stomach is hurting. I mean, there's all kinds of sensations that we have as human beings. So take a look at that handout on the 21 senses and pick a few. See if you can work those into your story. Be sure the first paragraphs of your scene establish the setting. Think about weather, time of day, time of year, seasons. I can't tell you how many times I read about characters that go outside and there's no reaction to the weather. Honestly, when I go outside, that's the very first thing I notice. Is that what you do? I mean, when you go outside, if it's really hot out, boom, you get hit with this heat and you've been in an air-conditioned room, you're going to notice that. You're not going to notice it 10 minutes later, like, oh my gosh, it's really hot and I'm sweating, right? You're also going to notice if it's early in the morning, or if there's a chill in the air, or if the air feels wet or damp from the fog, right? So there's a texture feeling there. So also the time of year is really important, because sometimes I'll read a book for 50 pages, 100 pages. I have no idea where this novel is set. And then the author might say that it's in the deep south. And I'm like, really? And I didn't even know what time of year it was. Is it summer where it's really muggy and hot? Or is it the winter and it's just damp and cold? I mean, are her clothes sticking to the back of her neck? I mean, I feel like this is so important because we're so aware of the weather. And while experts will tell you, or instructors will tell you, never start your novel with the weather. Granted, you don't want to just say it was a dark and stormy night. But again, you want to have a believable scene. So what's believable? What's believable is if your character is somewhere, she's going to be feeling something about the weather and the time of year. She might be locked in a cubicle down in a basement office, maybe not in that scene, but when she gets outside, she's going to notice what time of year it is. If the fall leaves are blowing and that crisp wind is biting her neck, we get a sensation of the fall. We get a feeling for that weather, that time of year, and that's really important. So also think about the time of day and how much time is passing. It's really important if you're moving from scene to scene to imply how much time has passed for your character, because if last we saw it was nighttime and she was doing something in the middle of the night, and now you show her, manicuring her toenails or something. That's not a manicure. Sorry, pedicure, getting a pedicure. You're still thinking it's the middle of the night. It seems kind of odd that she would be getting a pedicure. So you've got to establish the time of day for the most part. Basically, you want to just include these details that are going to transport your reader into your story, and that's by using sensory details. So choose intriguing settings that will add texture to your scene where possible. Try to avoid defaulting to coffee shops and restaurants. I can't tell you how many boring restaurants and coffee shop scenes I have read. I mean, I just want to gag myself with a Starbucks cup. I'm sorry. I had one beginning novelist, send his manuscript to me for a critique. He was a very famous attorney in San Francisco, but I found it just incredibly tedious to the point of absolute hysteria and hilarity that I counted 21 restaurant scenes in his novel. I let him know that. I would say if you really, really have to have a scene in a restaurant or a coffee shop because that's ordinary life, or it used to be before the coronavirus, I would keep it to one per novel, and I would make sure that something very important happens in that coffee shop or that restaurant, to the point where you probably couldn't have that scene set in any other place. Okay. That's going to be a challenge for you, because anything that you have happen in a coffee shop, I could bet you could probably put in a much more interesting setting. You need somebody to spill coffee on somebody, do it on the jogging path along the Thames River in front of Kew Gardens or something. I don't know. I mean, show the setting, bring it to life so that readers can see the place that your character's in. Okay, so those are the 8 steps to a perfect scene. I hope you'll take a look at the document. I hope you'll print out the PDF, make copies of it, and when you're about to sit down and write a scene, go through it. There's spaces for you to write things down. So do the brainstorming work first before you get writing your scene. Why? Because you're going to waste hours of time writing a boring scene that has too much boring stuff in it, that doesn't serve a purpose, that isn't written in your point of view character's voice or style. It doesn't reflect your character's mood or motivation or mindset in that moment. And it's not going to accomplish really anything that's going to be purposeful for your novel. So I hope that this has been interesting for you. I also want to take a look briefly at my scene structure checklist, which is going to also cover some of the things that I've just discussed. But let me read this definition that I have here from Jordan Rosenfeld's book, Make a Scene. Okay. She says, scenes are capsules in which compelling characters undertake significant actions in a vivid and memorable way that allows the events to feel as though they are happening in real time. And this is going back to what I said about cinematic technique. Okay? Everything has to feel as if you're watching it on a movie screen. So if you're watching a movie scene, for example, and there's all kinds of interesting action and characters are doing things and they're talking and stuff's happening, and all of a sudden the screen goes blank and you hear some voice, which you learn is the author who wrote the screenplay, the scriptwriter. And all of a sudden the scriptwriter starts talking and saying, okay, I want you to know about these different characters. John grew up in Brooklyn and he had a very poor family, and so he didn't have much to eat growing up. But as he got older, he decided he was going to become the best stockbroker in the world. So he studied hard and blah, 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 blah. And you're just thinking, why is the screen blank? I was watching these characters in all this really interesting action, and all of a sudden I'm just hearing this person tell me all about these characters. I don't want to hear about the characters. I don't want to be told. I just want to watch what's happening. So I hope I'm making my point here to you about showing, not telling, writing in a cinematic way so the the reader can watch your characters moment by moment happening in real time. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So capsule. The word capsule implies a limited, compressed period of time. Scenes start in one moment in the present action, and they move forward in time, and then they end. That's what I've been discussing this whole time. If you need a character to flash back on something, just have a quick little couple lines of flashback to have them triggered something that they need to think about in that moment that's important to your scene and important to your story. All of a sudden, they remember where that baseball came from and why that baseball is important to solving this clue, whatever. Okay. Of course, if you're writing a time travel story, your character might travel back and forth in time and flip around like the time traveler's wife. Fine. That's because that fits your premise and genre. But for most novels, you want to have a scene that starts in one moment and moves forward and doesn't skip around in time. Okay, she also mentioned the compelling characters that undertake significant actions. Okay, we want compelling characters. They have to have significant action. If they're the protagonist, what the protagonist is doing needs to advance that plot. If it's another character or other characters, they need to have significant impact on the protagonist and on him going after his goal. Okay, all characters can play different roles in a story. If you take a look at my brand new online course that I just put up on my online school, Teachable, it's called Your Cast of Characters. You'll learn that there's all different types of roles that characters can play, and they can play more than one role. But it's important to think about, when you're writing a scene, what characters do you need in that scene? What roles are they going to play? And how are they going to serve the purpose of your plot? How are they going to impact your protagonist? Because everything has to impact your protagonist, either directly or indirectly, because novels, films, stories, all are about one character basically going after a short-term goal. The exception to this, of course, are family sagas or biographies. You know, a movie like Gandhi isn't going to just be about a short-term goal. Okay. She mentions actions that occur that are vivid and memorable. Again, this speaks to sensory detail, bringing scenes to life without bogging down with too much unnecessary description. Okay. And then happening in real time. And that's what I already touched on. Backstory, long flashbacks, excessive narration, stop the present action and interrupt the pacing. You want to keep good pacing in your scenes. Okay. So my checklist has a checklist, and I'll pull that up on the screen so you can see it. Obviously, there's lots of items on the checklist, and I'm not going to go over them all right now, but you can go over them. And I would encourage you to first read through all these different items. Your scene isn't going to tick all of them off, because some scenes aren't going to need all these things. But you do want to consider all these different items on the checklist and see if they can be useful for your scene. For instance, let me read a few of them. My scene has a strong opening line or a hook that grabs the reader. We talked about that. My scene's important to the plot. I guess we've talked about that too. My scene helps reveal something new about the character or the plot. Again, that's about advancing the plot. My scene gives a brief nod to setting through the character's point of view. We talked about that. My scene stays in one point of view the whole time. Very important. Then we talk about dialogue and bits of narrative, making clear how much time has passed. Maybe elements of surprise or twists. My scene starts in a different way than the last scene started. Something to think about. And then what about getting rid of clunky words and clunky writing, tightening up, being concise with your writing. Think about your camera angles. Does my camera move around and show specific details where I want the reader to pay attention? Microtension. Do I create mystery? Microtension has a lot to do with keeping the reader on edge or wanting to know more. And I have a session. Microtension is a whole other topic, and I have blog posts on that, and I actually have a module in my emotional mastery course on microtension. If you don't know what that is, I think it would be good for you to do some research on that, because you need microtension on every single page. Honestly, believe me. So I hope that this session on scene structure is helpful. We kind of jumped around and looked at a lot of different things. I wanted to give you a brief overview of just all the basics. So just to review, scenes are best when they're capsules of time. They're best when they're done in a short period of 15 to 20 minutes for your character. They work best if you first know and identify what the purpose of your scene is, and make sure that purpose is tied in with the premise and the plot for your story, so that it's not just, oh, my scene is just so you can kind of get to know some new characters. No, we don't want that. Those new characters better serve a purpose, or out they go. And we also want to think about that high moment at the end. You want to build to that high moment and work backwards. I always work backwards. Start with your high moment. How is your scene going to end? What is the point of that scene? And then go back 20 minutes, figure out where your character can be, how you can set up his mood, his mindset, his motivation, so that that high moment will be punched home, okay? If you want to read a terrifically great opening scene, I use it a lot in my scene mastery boot camps. I would suggest that you read the opening scene to Candace And she is a master writer. I just finished reading her third book in the series. I couldn't put it down. It was fantastic. Her characters jump off the page. Amazing. But the opening scene to Candace Fox's Crimson Lake is brilliant. Even though it's a detective book, it's a story about a detective who teams up with another detective to solve a missing persons case. The first scene is all about this guy living in a ramshackled rented house in the swamps of Australia, and he rescues a goose and takes it to the vet. Why is it such a fantastic scene? I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to have you read it and you figure it out, okay? If you know that the purpose of the first scene in your novel is to set up your character, you will see why this scene is brilliant. It has nothing to do with the plot, nothing to do with the premise of the missing persons case, but it sets up the tone, the motivation, the mindset, and the mood perfectly. So I hope that this has been informative to you, and I hope you will dig into these charts and PDFs. My blog, Live, Write, Thrive, has more than 1 million words of instruction for writers. And of course, I have 10 or so books in my Writer's Toolbox series. So take a look at my books and check out the online courses at cslakin.teachable.com. I think you will find a plethora of instruction that you can feed on for months, if not years. And I hope that this is going to help you write great scenes, because scenes are the heart of a novel. And if your scenes are great, that's going to be your big first step to writing a great book. Thanks for taking the time to watch this, and I hope you've learned a lot.